There's an entire generation that grew up being told they were special, that they could be anything they wanted, that participation trophies and college degrees were tickets to success. If you were born between 1981 and 1996, you're a millennial, and you've probably spent the last decade being called entitled, lazy, and accused of killing everything from napkins to the housing market. But psychologists have been looking at something far more interesting. What happens to a generation raised on optimism who entered adulthood during the worst economic conditions since the Great Depression? Today, we're going to explore what makes them psychologically distinct. From the beginning, you were told you were exceptional. The self-esteem movement of the 1980s and 90s fundamentally changed how children were raised. You got trophies for showing up. Your artwork went on the fridge regardless of skill. Your parents, many of them baby boomers, wanted you to have everything they didn't: emotional validation, opportunities, choices. An entire generation was raised being told that believing in yourself was just as important as actual achievement. But here's what nobody anticipated. Research published in Psychological Science found that artificially inflating self-esteem without corresponding achievement doesn't create confidence. It creates fragile self-worth that depends on external validation. When you've been told you're special your entire childhood, and then the real world treats you as ordinary, that gap between expectation and reality does something to your psychology. And the real world hit hard. You graduated into the 2008 financial crisis or its aftermath. The implicit social contract, work hard, get a degree, get a good job, buy a house, turned out to be fundamentally broken. Millennials have significantly less wealth than previous generations did at the same age, despite being the most educated generation in history. You did everything right according to the script you were given, and it still didn't work. This creates cognitive dissonance. You were special and deserving. The world doesn't care. You worked hard and got educated. You still can't afford the life your parents had. That dissonance has shaped millennial psychology in profound ways. Consider work. Millennials are criticized for job hopping, for not showing company loyalty, for prioritizing work-life balance. But this isn't entitlement, it's adaptation. You watched your parents give decades to companies that laid them off during the recession. You learned that loyalty goes one direction, so you stopped giving it. This isn't laziness, it's rational response to economic reality. But here's the complexity. You're also the first generation to form your identity with social media as a constant presence. Social media emerged exactly when you were entering adulthood, during what psychologists identify as the critical period for identity formation. You were figuring out who you are in the most public way any generation ever has. Every relationship, every job change, every opinion, documented and broadcast. You're comparing your behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel, but it's deeper. You're forming your sense of self in a context where validation is quantified: likes, followers, engagement metrics. Your worth became measurable, visible, and never quite enough. This created what some call the anxiety generation, not because you're weak, but because the conditions you're navigating are genuinely more demanding than what previous generations faced. And here's one of the generation's strengths. You're emotionally literate in ways previous generations often aren't. You have language for boundaries, emotional labor, toxic behavior. You're willing to end relationships that aren't serving you, to quit jobs destroying your mental health. You grew up in an era where therapy became destigmatized, where mental health was finally treated as health. There's also this paradox around achievement. You were raised to believe you could be anything, that your potential was limitless, but you entered economic conditions where achieving basic stability feels impossible. You have high expectations because that's what you were taught, but you're dealing with student debt, gig economy jobs, unaffordable housing. So you're caught between wanting to achieve meaningful things and just trying to survive. This shows up in delayed milestones. You're postponing marriage, homeownership, children, not because you don't want these things, but because the conditions make them feel impossible or irresponsible. But rather than seeing this as failure, many millennials are redefining what success means. You're creating alternative family structures, prioritizing experiences over possessions, finding meaning outside traditional markers. This isn't settling, it's creating new frameworks when the old ones are broken. And you're doing it collectively. When you're all struggling with the same broken systems, you stop seeing it as personal failure. You start seeing it as structural. The rise of progressive politics among millennials, the attention to systemic inequality, the climate activism, these are the psychological response of a generation that was promised individual success, but learned that individual effort isn't enough when the systems are rigged. There's also your humor, dark, absurdist, self-deprecating in ways that baffle older generations. But psychologically, this makes perfect sense. Humor is a coping mechanism for anxiety and helplessness. The memes about never owning a home, about being tired all the time, they're not just jokes. They're a generation processing collective trauma through shared comedy. If you're a millennial, you probably feel simultaneously behind and exhausted from trying to catch up. You're the most educated generation with the least wealth. You were promised everything and inherited crises. But here's what the psychology reveals. You're not broken. The systems you inherited are broken. Your anxiety isn't irrational. It's a rational response to irrational conditions. Your commitment to mental health, to boundaries, to redefining success, these aren't weaknesses, they're adaptations. The millennial experience matters because you're navigating a fundamental shift in how society functions. You're caught between the old social contract and whatever comes next. You were shaped by forces you didn't choose: economic collapse, technological revolution, climate crisis, but you're reshaping the world in response. You're changing how we talk about mental health, how we think about work, how we define success and community. That's the real psychology of Gen Y. Not entitled or lazy, but adaptive, emotionally intelligent, collectively conscious, and tired in ways that are completely understandable. You're not failing at the life you were promised, you're creating new lives from the ruins of promises that were never going to be kept. And that takes a kind of strength that doesn't get nearly enough recognition.